In 1988, a woman in Kapuskasing, Ontario, kept a notebook in her kitchen drawer. It was not a recipe book. It was a list of every meal she made for herself after her husband died. She wrote down what she ate, what it cost, and how many days it lasted. By the end of the first year, she had made 43 different one-pot meals. By the end of the fifth year, she had narrowed it to 7. The same 7 meals in rotation, week after week, for 5 years. 3 of those meals are on this list. She told her niece that the meals did not need to be different. They needed to be possible. Number 20 on this list costs 60 cents and lasts 3 days. Number 12 uses one ingredient that most people throw in the garbage. Number 1 has not been made in most Canadian kitchens since the 1970s, and it is the single best one-pot meal ever invented for a person eating alone. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 cheap Canadian one-pot meals for seniors living alone no one makes anymore. Number 25. The creamy potato soup with dried dill. Potatoes diced small, an onion, a knob of butter, water, and a generous pinch of dried dill simmered until the potatoes collapsed. No cream needed. The starch from the potatoes thickened the broth into something that looked and tasted creamy on its own. The dill gave it a brightness that turned plain potato soup into something a person might actually look forward to eating. Ukrainian and Polish seniors across the prairies made this every week, because dill was the herb that grew in every garden and dried on every kitchen ceiling. A pot of it cost about 50 cents and lasted 3 days, and the dill was free if you had dried it yourself in August. Number 24. Bologna and potato stew. Thick slices of bologna cut into cubes and fried in a pot until the edges browned. Potatoes and onion were added. Water was poured in. It simmered for 20 minutes. The bologna gave the broth a salty, smoky flavor that mimicked sausage at a quarter of the price. A ring of bologna cost $2 and lasted a week. The potatoes cost pennies. For a senior who could not afford smoked sausage or ham, bologna was the working-class substitute that nobody talked about and everybody ate. In small towns across northern Ontario and the Maritimes, this was Thursday night supper, and the pot was scraped clean. Number 23. Canned stew stretched with potatoes. A tin of Puritan or Habitant beef stew was opened and poured into a pot. 2 potatoes were diced and added. Enough water was added to thin it. It was simmered until the potatoes were tender. The tin cost $2. The potatoes cost 30 cents. Together, they turned a single serving tin into a pot that lasted 2 meals. For a senior who did not have the energy to brown meat or chop carrots, this was the compromise between cooking from scratch and eating from a tin. The potatoes were the only fresh ingredient. Everything else came from the cupboard. The whole meal took 15 minutes and required 1 knife, 1 pot, and 1 burner. Number 22. Oxtail soup. 1 pound of oxtail, the cheapest cut at the butcher, browned in a pot and simmered for 3 hours with root vegetables, barley, and salt. The bones released a gelatinous richness that no other cut could match, and the meat fell away in shreds so tender they dissolved on the tongue. Oxtail was the cut that nobody wanted, which is why it cost almost nothing. West Indian seniors in Toronto who had grown up cooking with oxtail made this every week. Scottish seniors in the Maritimes made a version with turnip and carrot. The recipe crossed cultures because cheap bones produced the best broth in any language. A single pot lasted 4 or 5 days and improved with every reheating as the collagen continued to break down and the broth got thicker and richer. Number 21. Corn chowder from a tin. A tin of creamed corn, a potato diced small, an onion, butter, milk, or water. Everything goes in a pot and simmers for 20 minutes. The creamed corn is the base and the thickener, doing the work that cream and flour would normally do. The potato gives it substance. The onion gives it sweetness. A bowl of corn chowder with a piece of bread is a full meal that cost about 75 cents. and it tasted like a rainy afternoon in a farmhouse kitchen where someone was looking after things. On the prairies, where corn came in tins year-round and potatoes came from the root cellar, this was the soup of November through March. Number 20. Vermicelli in broth. A handful of thin vermicelli noodles dropped into a pot of boiling chicken broth. 3 minutes. That was the whole meal. The noodles cooked in the time it took to set the table, if setting the table meant putting one bowl and one spoon in one place. A box of vermicelli cost $1 and lasted a month. A carton of broth cost $2 and made 4 bowls. For a senior whose appetite had shrunk to almost nothing, this was the meal that went down without resistance. Warm, thin, salty, and gone before the stomach could decide to reject it. Italian seniors in Hamilton called it pasta in brodo and served it when someone was sick or grieving. It was the soup that said you need to eat something, and I'm not going to make it difficult. 60 cents a bowl. 3 minutes of standing. That is what survival tastes like when it refuses to be complicated. Number 19. Turnip and potato mash. Turnip and potatoes were peeled, cubed, and boiled together in one pot until soft. They were drained and mashed with butter and salt, right in the pot. In Newfoundland, they called it bang, and they ate it 2 or 3 nights a week with nothing beside it except a glass of water. The turnip gave the mash a peppery sweetness that plain potatoes lacked. The butter made it rich. The whole pot cost about 60 cents and filled a person up completely. For a senior living alone, mashing vegetables in the pot they cooked in meant no extra bowls, no extra dishes, and no reason to use more than one burner. You cooked, you mashed, you ate, you washed one pot. That arithmetic mattered when washing dishes required standing at the sink. Number 18. Cabbage and bacon soup. A few strips of bacon, chopped and fried in the bottom of a pot until crisp. Half a head of cabbage, roughly chopped and added. Water poured in, and the soup was simmered for 20 minutes. The bacon fat flavored the entire pot. The cabbage softened and sweetened, and the broth turned smoky and rich. A head of cabbage cost $1. A package of bacon cost $5 and provided enough for 4 pots of soup. Each pot lasted 2 to 3 days. For a senior, the hardest part was chopping the cabbage. Even that could be done sitting at the kitchen table with a cutting board on your lap. Everything else was pouring and waiting. Number 17. Hot dog and bean pot. 2 or 3 wieners sliced into coins. A tin of baked beans, a squirt of mustard, a splash of ketchup, into a pot on low heat for 10 minutes. This was the meal that children loved and adults pretended to outgrow, and seniors returned to in their 70s because the body remembers what fed it and does not care about dignity. A package of wieners lasted a week in the fridge. A tin of beans cost 89 cents. Together, they made a meal that was warm and filling and tasted like the 1960s, which is where most of the people eating it wished they still lived. Number 16. Fish and potato pot. A tin of mackerel or sardines is broken apart in a pot with diced potatoes, onion, and water. It is simmered for 15 minutes. The fish falls apart into the broth. The potatoes soften and the whole thing tastes like a maritime kitchen on a Tuesday evening when the wind is coming off the water and the stove is the warmest thing in the house. Tinned fish was the cheapest protein in the grocery store. A tin cost $1. The potatoes cost 30 cents. The pot lasted 2 days. For seniors in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick who had grown up on fish, this was not a step down. It was home cooking, adapted for a kitchen that only had one person left in it. First pattern break. Here is the mathematics of cooking for one that nobody teaches. A recipe for 4 costs $5. A recipe for 1 costs $3 because you cannot buy 1 carrot or 1 potato or 1 onion. You buy the same bag of 5 and the other 4 go soft in the fridge before you use them. A senior cooking for 1 pays more per meal than a family of 4, gets less variety, and wastes more food. The economics of eating alone are punitive. They punish the person for being 1 instead of 4. These one-pot meals fought back against that math by using ingredients that kept dried beans, rice, canned goods, root vegetables that lasted weeks in a cool cupboard. Every item on this list was designed by someone who understood that the grocery store is not built for a household of 1, and decided to beat it anyway. Number 15. Leftover roast dinner soup. This was not a recipe. It was a system. Whatever was left from Sunday's roast, the meat scraps, the gravy, the vegetables that nobody finished, went into a pot with water on Monday morning. By Monday evening it was soup. The roast beef became beef soup. The roast chicken became chicken soup. The pork became pork and vegetable soup. No 2 Monday soups were the same, because no 2 Sunday dinners were the same. For a senior who still roasted a small piece of meat on Sundays out of habit, Monday soup was the reward, the meal that turned yesterday's effort into today's ease. The pot that required nothing except reheating what had already been cooked. Number 14. Kraft dinner with canned peas. A box of Kraft dinner made according to the directions. A tin of peas drained and stirred in at the end. The peas added a vegetable. The Kraft dinner added everything else. It cost about $1.50 total, and it made 2 bowls. For a senior who knew they should eat a vegetable but could not face chopping one, the tin of peas was the compromise. Open, drain, stir. 3 extra steps that added nutrition without adding effort. This was the meal that home care workers saw most often in the kitchens of their clients, and they never judged it because they understood that any meal is better than no meal. Number 13. Mushroom barley soup. A handful of pearl barley, a tin of mushrooms drained and sliced, an onion, water, salt, and pepper. It simmered for an hour on low. The barley swelled, and the mushrooms gave the broth an earthiness that made it taste like a forest floor after rain. The whole pot cost about $1.25. For Jewish seniors in Montreal and Toronto who had grown up eating mushroom barley soup on Friday nights, this was the taste of Shabbat. In a 1-bedroom apartment where the table was set for 1. The recipe had not changed in 100 years. The kitchen had changed. The number of chairs had changed. But the soup was the same. Number 12. Bone broth with whatever vegetables are left. This was the meal that used what other people threw away. A chicken carcass saved from last week's roast. A beef bone from the butcher that cost 50 cents. Dropped into a pot with water and simmered for 3 or 4 hours. Whatever vegetables were going soft in the fridge, carrots bending, celery wilting, onion sprouting, went in during the last 30 minutes. The broth was golden and rich, and it cost almost nothing because the ingredients had already been paid for or were about to be discarded. A senior who understood this trick never wasted a bone and never threw away a vegetable. Everything had a second life in the pot. That understanding that nothing is finished until the pot says it is finished was the foundation of every kitchen that ever fed a family on almost nothing. Second pattern break. Here is what disappears when a senior stops cooking. Not just the meals, the smell. A kitchen that has something simmering on the stove smells like a place where someone lives. A kitchen where the stove has not been turned on in 3 days, smells like a room. That difference, the difference between a kitchen and a room, is the difference between a person who is managing and a person who has stopped. These one-pot meals exist to keep the kitchen smelling like a kitchen, to keep the stove warm, to keep the pot on the burner and the spoon in the drawer and the bowl on the table and the person in the chair. The meal itself is almost secondary. What matters is the act, the decision to stand up, walk to the stove, and make something. That decision, made alone, every day, in a kitchen built for a family that is no longer there, is the bravest thing most people will never see. Number 11, creamed tuna on toast made in a pot. A tin of tuna drained. A few tablespoons of butter melted in the pot. Flour stirred in to make a roux. Milk added slowly, stirring until it thickened into a white sauce. The tuna folded into the sauce, then poured over toast. This was the meal that every Canadian mother made in the 1960s and 70s when the budget was shot and the children still needed feeding. It was fast, it was cheap, and the white sauce made it feel like a proper meal even when the tuna was the cheapest tin on the shelf. Seniors who made this were not making dinner. They were making 1968. They stood at the stove the way their mother stood, stirring the same sauce, feeding the same hunger, in a kitchen that had gotten quieter with every decade. Number 10, Scotch broth, a lamb neck or shank, the cheapest cut at the butcher, simmered in water with barley, turnip, carrot, leek, and cabbage for 2 to 3 hours. The Scots brought this recipe to Nova Scotia, and it stayed for 300 years because cheap lamb and root vegetables and barley never stopped being cheap. A single lamb neck cost $2 and flavored a pot that lasted 5 days. The barley thickened everything. The vegetables sweetened as they cooked. The lamb fell apart into the broth. Scottish-Canadian seniors in Cape Breton and Pictou County made this every winter, and the smell of it, meaty and earthy and touched with the sweetness of turnip, was the smell of a kitchen that still functioned. Number 9, red lentil and tomato soup. Red lentils, a tin of tomatoes, an onion, a teaspoon of cumin, and salt. 20 minutes. The lentils dissolved completely and turned the broth thick and golden. The tomatoes gave it acid and brightness. The cumin gave it a warmth that plain lentil soup lacked. A bag of red lentils cost $1 and made 8 pots. For South Asian seniors in Mississauga and Surrey who had grown up eating dal every day of their lives, this was not a poverty meal. It was the most normal meal in the world. The fact that it also happened to be the cheapest and most filling thing a person could make in 20 minutes was just proof that their grandmothers had always been right. Number 8, corned beef hash in a pot. A tin of corned beef, broken apart with a fork. 2 potatoes, diced, an onion. Everything fried together in a pot with a little oil until the potatoes crisped and the corned beef browned. An egg cracked on top, the lid on for the last 3 minutes if you wanted it. This was the meal of Saturday mornings in the 50s that became the meal of Tuesday evenings in the 80s, when a senior realized that the distinction between breakfast and dinner no longer applied to a person eating alone. The tin cost $2. The potatoes cost 30 cents. The meal lasted twice. Nobody was watching. Nobody cared what time of day it was. The rules about what constituted proper dinner had stopped applying when the table went from 4 chairs to 1. Number 7, carrot and ginger soup. Carrots and onion, a thumb of fresh ginger, butter, and water. Simmered for 20 minutes, mashed in the pot with a fork or a potato masher. The ginger gave it a heat that cleared the sinuses and warmed the chest, and the carrots turned it a deep sunset orange that made the bowl look like it held something from a restaurant. A bag of carrots cost $1. A thumb of ginger cost 40 cents. The whole pot cost less than $2 and lasted 3 days. For a senior with a cold or a chest infection, this soup was medicine that tasted better than anything the pharmacy sold. The warmth of it went straight to the bones. Number 6, sausage and lentil pot. A couple of smoked sausage links sliced into coins. A cup of green or brown lentils. An onion. A carrot. Water and salt. Simmered for 30 minutes. The sausage gave the broth a smoky depth, and the lentils thickened everything, and the carrot sweetened as it softened. This was the one-pot meal that hit every mark. Protein from the sausage and lentils, fiber from the lentils, vegetables from the carrot and onion, a full nutritional profile from a pot that cost about $2 and lasted 4 days. For a senior whose doctor had told them to eat better without explaining how, this pot was the answer to a question they did not know how to ask. Number 5. Tomato and bread soup. Stale bread torn into pieces and dropped into a pot of simmering tinned tomatoes with garlic, salt, and olive oil. 15 minutes. The bread dissolved and thickened the soup into something halfway between porridge and stew. Italian families called it papa al pomodoro, and it was the meal of poverty that became the meal of comfort, which is what always happens when a food survives long enough to cross the line between necessity and nostalgia. A senior who kept bread and tinned tomatoes in the house could make this without a trip to the store. The bread did not need to be fresh. In fact, the staler the better. That was the genius. The ingredient that had failed at being bread succeeded at being soup. Number 4. Ham and potato soup. A leftover ham bone or a small piece of smoked ham hock, potatoes, onion, and water simmered together for 2 hours until the ham fell apart and the potatoes dissolved into the broth. A ham bone was free if you had bought a ham at Christmas or Easter. A ham hock cost $2 at the butcher. Either way, the pot lasted 5 days, and every day the broth got richer as the bone continued to give. For a senior who kept a ham bone in the freezer specifically for this purpose, the soup was not spontaneous. It was planned. It was the meal that existed in the future, waiting in the freezer as a frozen bone wrapped in plastic, holding the promise that next week there would be something to eat for 5 days that required nothing except time and water. Number 3. Chicken back and vegetable soup. Chicken backs were cheap, less than $1 a pound, because nobody wanted them. They were bones and skin and small pockets of dark meat. They were the single best soup ingredient in the grocery store. A senior who bought $1's worth of chicken backs could make a pot of soup that rivaled anything made from a whole bird. The backs went into the pot with water, onion, carrot, celery, and salt. 2 hours of simmering, and the bones gave up everything. The broth was golden and rich. The scraps of meat pulled away and fell into the liquid. A handful of noodles or rice went in during the last 10 minutes. The whole pot cost less than $2 and lasted nearly a week. The women who knew to buy chicken backs learned it from their mothers, who learned it from theirs, who learned it during a time when throwing away any part of any animal was unthinkable. Number 2. Beans and rice. A cup of dried beans soaked overnight, a cup of rice, an onion, salt, cumin or chili powder if you had it. The beans went into a pot with water in the morning and simmered for 2 hours until they were soft. The rice went in during the last 20 minutes. The whole thing cost about 60 cents and made enough for 3 days. Together, beans and rice form a complete protein. That is not a modern nutritional discovery. That is a fact that every poor community on Earth has understood for thousands of years. Caribbean seniors in Toronto and Montreal made this with kidney beans and thyme. Mexican seniors made it with pintos and cumin. Portuguese seniors in the Azores diaspora made it with white beans and bay leaf. The recipe crossed every border because hunger has no nationality, and the solution to it has always been the same. Beans, rice, salt, a pot, a flame, enough. Number 1. Soup from a bare cupboard. This is not one recipe. It is the last recipe. The one a senior makes when the cupboard holds almost nothing. The pension is 4 days away, and the grocery store might as well be on the moon. You look at what is left: a potato, half an onion, a tin of something, a handful of rice or pasta or barley, and salt. You put water in a pot, you add whatever you have, and you simmer it until it becomes soup. It will not taste like anything specific. It will taste like hot water with things in it, but it will be warm, and it will be food, and it will keep you upright for one more day. This is the meal every grandmother knew how to make without thinking. The meal that has no name because it is different every time. The meal that requires no recipe because the recipe is whatever is left. It is the oldest one-pot meal in human history, and it is being made tonight, right now, in kitchens across this country, by people who have nothing except a pot and whatever they can find. And the fact that it works, that a pot of water and whatever you have is always enough to call supper, is the only proof you need that the people who invented cooking did it not for pleasure, but for survival. And survival in a quiet kitchen with one chair, one pot, and one burner is still a meal worth making. Here is my challenge. Think of a senior you know, a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor down the hall. Now think about what is in their cupboard right now. Not what they told you is in there, but what is actually in there. If the answer makes you uneasy, do something about it. Not next week. Today, bring groceries, bring soup, bring yourself, sit at their table, and eat with them. The loneliest thing about these meals is not the food. It is the silence across the table, where someone used to sit. Share which one your mother or grandmother made in the comments. I want to know if the chicken back soup gets the recognition it deserves. I want to know if anyone else's grandmother stretched a ham bone into a week of suppers. These meals are not just recipes. They are the last line of independence for people who refuse to stop feeding themselves, even when the kitchen has gone quiet and the cupboard is almost bare. That refusal, that stubborn daily decision to stand up and walk to the stove, is the most Canadian thing I know.